Lineup decisions win or lose weeks, period. So I'm going to simplify it for you. We're talking running backs and wide receivers for week 7. Green light players, you start with confidence. Yellow light players, you think about based on your roster, maybe temper expectations. And red light players, you should probably get away from. We're talking usage, we're talking matchups, and for some of these players, we're going pretty deep. Let's get started with some green light running backs. First off, Quinshon Judkins going up against Miami. I think he's in a great spot this week at home. Miami's defense is allowing the most rushing yards per game, the second most yards per carry over the season, and the most over the last 4 games, the 5th most fantasy points allowed over the last 4, and also throughout the course of the season. So even before Rico Dowdle ran all over them 2 weeks ago, they were already giving up the 6th most rushing yards per game, the 8th most rushing touchdowns per game, and the 7th most fantasy points per game. He's at home. There's less of a risk for Miami to go up and for them to abandon the run. And, given their defense, I think they hold them to a neutral game script here at the very least, and Judkins has a big bounce back game. Dobbins also had a down game last week, but it was really because he's been relatively dependent on touchdowns. But this week, it's hard to not keep him in the lineup. The Giants are top 10 in allowing both rushing yards per game and rushing touchdowns per game to running backs for fantasy. They're also giving up the 3rd most yards per carry to running backs this season and over the last 4 games as well. The Broncos are favored in this game by 7 points, so the volume should be there for him, which should lead to a pretty solid output, given the fact that the Giants have given up the 12th most fantasy points to running backs and the fact that DVOA-wise, the Giants are the 2nd worst rushing defense in the NFL. Let's move on to some yellow light running backs. First off, Bill Croskey-Merritt at Dallas. 2 fumbles over the last 2 games, but it seems like the keys to the backfield have been given to Bill. And despite the down week, he gets Dallas this week. So he's just really tough to sit. The Cowboys, top 10 in rushing yards per game given up, rushing touchdowns, yards per carry, receptions, receiving yards, all to the running back position. As a result, they've given up the 3rd most fantasy points as well. This is one of the highest game totals of the week. Shootout potential, 3rd highest implied total for the Commanders, 4th highest for the Cowboys. This is what good fantasy matchups are made of. Even before Rico Dowdle ran all over the Cowboys last week, they were giving up the 6th most fantasy points to the running back position already, the 7th most rushing touchdowns, and they were allowing a ton through the air as well. Let's talk about Jordan Mason against Philly. We should be relatively back in on Jordan Mason this week. Jalen Carter is back, so that helps the Eagles a ton, but I don't think it's everything for them. They've given up the 9th most rushing yards per game to running backs, the 5th most rushing touchdowns, and I know what you're thinking. Even before Cam Skattebo's 3 touchdowns in week 6, they were giving up the 12th most rushing touchdowns per game to running backs. They're also in the top half of the league in yards per attempt to opposing running backs, and they've given up the 8th most fantasy points as well. And believe it or not, before Skattebo's 3 touchdown game, the 8th most fantasy points given up as well. So not a terrible matchup for Mason. He's at home, well rested after the bye, solid RB2 this week with some potential for volume. Let's talk Cam Skattebo going into Denver. Pretty tough matchup overall for the Giants going into Denver. Only a 16.75 implied team total. That's the lowest of the week. As much as I'm a Cam Skattebo fan, he might be a risky start this week. But hey, running backs who get volume don't grow on trees. You just need to temper expectations. But it's worth noting that Denver's given up the 3rd fewest rushing touchdowns to running backs, only 3.5 yards per carry over the last 4 weeks, the 2nd fewest receptions, and the 4th fewest fantasy points per game. So we'll see if Skattebo can overcome this matchup. All right, let's talk one of the hottest names going against the New York Jets, Rico Dowdle. The Jets defense better than the defense Rico has gone up against the last couple weeks, Dolphins and the Cowboys. Chuba is likely back in this game as well. If we look at the matchup, the Jets are giving up around 4 yards per carry to running backs, so not what I would consider a great matchup. They also don't give up anything through the air to running backs, but they've allowed the 10th most rushing yards per game simply through volume, the 10th most rushing touchdowns per game as well. DVOA wise, which tells you like really how good the defense is against the run, they're 4th best. But because their offense is likely to struggle in this game, there could be some turnovers. There could be some turnovers and some short fields potentially. Maybe, there could be some volume to go around because of that. The question is how much volume and how much of a split is this going to be? So I'm willing to start Rico Dowdle after what he did over the last few weeks and hope that it keeps going. I'd assume the Panthers want to keep that momentum going while making sure that Chuba Hubbard doesn't re-aggravate that calf again. So it's tough for me to start Chuba Hubbard right now. He'd probably be on my bench this week. We just don't know what his role is going to be and how limited he's going to be. I think that's one of the bigger things to watch for this Sunday. After what Rico's done over the last couple weeks, it's very, very tough to bench him. He should be in lineups. Let's talk DeAndre Swift against New Orleans. Big game on Monday night, but can the momentum carry? That's the question. Rainy conditions on Monday night, right? That could have played a factor in Swift's performance. That missed tackle on the reception on the sideline, like maybe that tackle gets made outside of slick conditions. But they did switch up the rushing scheme a bit, a lot more outside runs, and it really worked out for Swift. And he was really decisive, not something that I'm used to when watching DeAndre Swift. But against New Orleans now, this is a tough matchup. Third fewest yards per carry given up to running backs over the last 4 games. And the Saints are 18th or lower in rushing yards per game given up, rushing touchdowns per game given up, receptions, receiving yards per game, fantasy points per game given up to opposing running backs. So a little bit rough yellow light for DeAndre Swift. Just temper expectations here. Let's start Kimani Vidal, the hottest waiver wire pickup last week, this week, going up against Indy. I'm starting Vidal as a low-end RB2 in this game. The Colts have been relatively stingy in terms of production overall given up. 4th fewest fantasy points given up over the last 4 weeks. 15th or lower in rushing yards per game given up to running backs, touchdowns given up per game, yards per carry, receptions, receiving yards per game given up to running backs. But the Colts actually ranked 21st in rushing DVOA, so this could be a sneaky good matchup if the volume is there. And because Vidal was involved in all phases, the run and the receiving game last week, he can be relatively safe and have a decent floor, especially if he continues to run at a 54% route participation rate and get 11% target share like he got this past week. He was in the field for most passing down situations on top of this 72% rushing attempt share that he had. And you look at the Chargers this week, they have the 6th highest implied total for the week. So a running back who can get 15 plus touches in this type of spot, which should be a close game, by the way. I think he's easily in the top 24 range at the running back position. Let's talk about a couple desperate yellow running backs, right? A couple of guys that, you're in a tough spot and you're like, man, what should I do? And these guys are on your bench and like, you really don't want to play them, but I'm saying I think you might be able to, okay? First of all, Rhamondre Stevenson at Tennessee. We talked about him in the buy show. And again, like just to clarify, I'm not buying him like because I'm so bullish, but he's so cheap that I think he's worth buying. His value could go up. But most rushing touchdowns given up by Tennessee, 5th most rushing yards per game, 9th highest yards per carry, 4th most fantasy points, and the Patriots are favored by 7 points. So there could be a lot of volume here. Isiah Pacheco going up against Vegas, another one, desperate, right? But 77% snap share last week. That's a lot, okay? He's a dart throw, but the Raiders are giving up the 4th most rushing touchdowns per game to running backs. That's really what you want. He had all 3 goal line snaps for the Chiefs last week. The Raiders are also giving up 4.5 yards per carry to running backs over the last 4 weeks. Chiefs favored by 11.5 points, 2nd highest team implied total. So you're hoping for some touchdowns here. All right, let's talk red light running backs. I'm a little bit iffy on the Texans backfield this week, both Nick Chubb and Woody Marks. First off, the backfield is tough to decipher, right? Like they'll go with Woody Marks one week, Nick Chubb the next. Second, they're going into Seattle in a really tough matchup, right? Seattle's given up the fewest rushing yards per game, the fewest yards per carry this season, the fewest over the last 3 games as well. But here's the thing. They give up a ton of production through the air to running back. So Woody Marks could be the preferred start here over Nick Chubb, who is mostly their early down guy. The Texans have one of the lowest team implied totals of the week at 18.5. They're underdogs in this one. So if I'm going to be starting one of these guys out of desperation, it's probably Marks. And you never know. Like there could be a little bit of a post-buy rookie bump from what we saw back a couple weeks ago when he got all the work, or most of the work, I should say. You might see that the Seahawks have given up the 11th most fantasy points to running backs this year, but it's gone down to 21st over the last 4 games. And then Breece Hall against Carolina. Like I get it, like without Garrett Wilson, like maybe he just like gets more volume in this one, but Carolina isn't the same bad rushing defense we've been used to lately. 21st most rushing yards per game given up to running backs, 3.64 yards per carry to running backs over the last 4 weeks. That's really low. And believe it or not, they're the 3rd best rushing defense by DVOA this year. Crazy. Not the Carolina that we're used to. No Garrett Wilson, so what happens to the Jets offense? There's a lot of confusion there. All right, let's move on to green light wide receivers. Let's start with Courtland Sutton going up against the Giants. He should be an auto start, but just putting him here in case anyone is second guessing him after last week, right? Tough matchup against Sauce Gardner. This week, he gets the Giants. Most receiving yards, most receptions, and the 3rd most fantasy points per game given up. Clear number 1 wide receiver on the Broncos. They had the 11th highest implied total for the week. I'm not overthinking it. He's in. Let's talk about McConkey, Keenan Allen, Chargers wide receivers. Quentin Johnston's hamstring still doesn't seem like it's 100% limited to start the week. Both of those guys worth putting up in your lineup this week. The Colts are giving up the 4th most receiving yards, the 2nd most receptions, the 7th most receiving touchdowns, and the 4th most fantasy points per game. The 3rd most over the last 4 weeks. 6th highest implied total on the week. It's really hard to bench either of these guys while Quinton Johnson is out. They're in. Let's talk Rashee Rice. Like, you got to get him in there. You've been waiting this long. The Raiders are giving up the 5th most receiving yards per game, the 4th most receptions, which is right up Rashee's alley, the 5th most fantasy points per game. The Chiefs have the 2nd highest implied total on the week. Now, Rashee didn't get into practice with these guys, for this entire time, and he just got back to practice basically this week. So can he start slow? Yes, maybe. So he's still a low-end wide receiver 1 for me. That's why he's not like top 5 for me this week, but it could take a week for him to kind of get back into the swing of things and for Mahomes to like really, really pepper him. But there's a chance that he just comes out of the gate straight up swinging. Let's talk Mike Evans going into Detroit. If he is active, he's in. Not overthinking the injury, not overthinking anything. This hamstring thing is like a yearly occurrence for him, so he's totally used to it. Came in last year after his annual hamstring injury and ended up being just fine. Detroit secondary is banged up. 2nd most receiving touchdowns per game given up to wide receivers. The 6th most fantasy points as well. He's a lone wide receiver in Tampa. If he goes with Emeka Egbuka out, Chris Godwin out as well, the Bucs still have the 8th highest implied total on the week. Their game is also tied for the highest overall total for the week as well. Let's talk Jaylen Waddle going into Cleveland. This might be a tough matchup in your head, like, oh my God, they're going into Cleveland, but Cleveland runs the 3rd most single high coverage. Waddle against single high coverage is being targeted at a 32% rate versus 19% against too high. 3.13 yards per route run against single high versus 1.96 against too high. So good matchup. Also, Cleveland's given up the 11th most fantasy points per game to perimeter wide receivers as well. So Waddle's in for a good one. DK was also someone who thrived against single high coverage. I talked about it last week, and he got it done. Let's talk Odunze against New Orleans. Rough conditions in this last game, right? Like, you can't really take too much out of it. Caleb also missed him on what would have been a long touchdown in this game. Like, he just like underthrew it, maybe because of the conditions. Also, the BS illegal formation called on his touchdown as well. So there's a few spots where, Rome could have got it done. He goes up against a defense that gives up the 5th most receiving touchdowns per game, the 6th most fantasy points allowed over the last 4 weeks, 25-point team implied total on the week. DJ Moore's banged up. New Orleans also plays the 6th most single high coverage. Odunze averages 2.41 yards per route run against single high to 1.68 against too high. So advantage there. Also, he gets targeted at a higher rate against single high coverage, 28% versus 20% against too high. So advantage Odunze. Let's talk some yellow light wide receivers. Stefon Diggs, rough game last week, but again, could have had a much bigger day if he didn't get that offensive pass interference. Would have been another 50 yards tacked onto his total. The weeks before, you can't ignore 41% target share, 44% target share, and you can't ignore how well Drake May is playing right now. The Titans are giving up the 9th most receiving yards to wide receivers, but with the Pats favored by 7 points, like, are we sure that the overall volume is going to be there for the pass game? That's my only concern going into this game. If this isn't a competitive game, we could see a low attempt number for May. But Tennessee isn't a good passing defense. Their run game hasn't really been effective. They're going to hit that 24.5 team implied total somehow. That's the 9th most this week. Also, like, if you're worried about Kayshon Boutte, he hasn't really done much against too high safety coverage this year. He's way better against single high, like last week. Tennessee plays the 2nd most too high coverage in the league, and Diggs has the same target rate in both single high and too high at 28% per route run. Boutte, 19% against single high, 9% against too high, and it's too high this week. So not looking good for Boutte. All right, let's talk Brian Thomas Jr. Can he have a repeat performance? Probably not. By the way, he had another very long touchdown reception that got called back on a Travis Hunter offsides call. Could have had an even bigger game last week. The Rams are a tough defense against the pass, 5th best DVOA, 8th fewest fantasy points given up to wide receivers. The game is in London. I don't love that. I never do. And also because I gotta pay attention to a game at 9:30 in the morning. But also, now I know the West Coast folks are like, oh, well, 9:30. Oh my God, that's not good. Oh my God. We have to wake up at 6:30. I get it. But it sucks for us too. You know what really sucks? East Coast and the Monday night games, like 10 p.m. Like, are you kidding me? I'm an old man. I can't do this. Anyway, the Rams, they haven't really been tested this year. Like, even though like they haven't been giving up a lot. Last week they had no Lamar. The week before that, Kendrick Bourne went off against them. 10 catches for 142 yards. The week before that, Michael Pittman had a decent day, right? 5 for 41 and a touchdown. The week before that, both Eagles wide receivers went off against them. And then the week before that, the Titans and the Texans. So BTJ, he's going to be in my lineup. It was nice seeing the rapport start to kick into gear a little bit. Hopefully that continues moving forward. Let's talk Tetairoa McMillan. This is a tough one. Like, if you want to bench him, like, I kind of get it, but it's tough to bench somebody who just scored 2 touchdowns last week, has a high target share. But he's going up against Sauce Gardner, right? Like, Sutton had 1 catch for 17 yards last week. Pickens, 2 catches for 57 yards and a touchdown. Evans, 4 catches for 33 yards and a touchdown. Tough matchup. So do what you got to do here. Maybe you'll have another option. I don't know. Kendrick Bourne, like, Ricky Pearsall, he opened the week without practicing. Not sure what his status is this week. Juwan Jennings seems to be running a whole lot of cardio out there with all the injuries he's faced with. So we could potentially see another Kendrick Bourne week, 2 straight weeks with exactly 142 receiving yards. Atlanta's a bit of a tougher matchup though. Number 1 DVOA against the pass. They've given up the 6th fewest receiving yards per game, receptions per game, and fantasy points per game for the season and over the last 4 weeks. Let's talk Michael Pittman. No Josh Downs potentially this week. The Chargers not giving up much through the air. 3rd fewest receiving yards to wide receivers, 2nd fewest touchdowns, 3rd fewest fantasy points per game, but this could be a competitive game, right? And also, number 1 wide receivers haven't been so bad against them. Like Waddle last week, 6 for 95, 9 for 96 and a touchdown from Debo the week before. Courtland Sutton, 6 for 118 and a touchdown a few weeks back. So not a spot I need to stay away from necessarily because of the perceived matchup on paper. Should get targets potentially without Downs in the lineup this week. That's going to do it for this episode, guys. I hope this helped. I'll see you in the live on Instagram at Upper Hand Fantasy, Sunday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern. See you guys there. Peace.